In this section, we'll take a detailed look at the object interface. In video 1, we'll take a look at the main object interface and learn about the options it provides us. In video 2, we'll look at events in objects and what they're used for. Then in video 3, we'll look at inheritance between objects and why it's useful. And finally, in video 4, we'll take a brief look at the physics options available. After this, we'll know our way around the object interface and be ready to use them when making our own games. So let's get started. We'll take a look at linking a sprite to an object and the main basic settings for objects. The main object interface is where we create the objects for our game. This includes everything from naming to programming. The main window is where we find options regarding the name of the object and the sprite linked to it. Objects do not require sprites, but it's extremely common to link a sprite to an object, for example linking the player sprite to the player object. A name can be set by typing the desired name into the name field. We should remember our naming conventions when doing this. Typically, object names are preceded by obj, which stands for object. Below this, we can find options regarding sprites. To link a sprite, we can click on the area labelled by default with no sprite, as no sprite has been linked at this time. This will bring up an interface for selecting the desired sprite. There are also 3 smaller buttons within the sprite options. The first creates a new sprite. This is a nice shortcut if we need to make a new sprite for this object. By default, the other 2 options are grayed out as no sprite has been selected and they apply to the currently selected sprite. The first of these buttons will open the sprite properties, which is where we find settings for sprite's name, origin, collision mask, and more. The second will open the image editor where we can draw and edit the image contained within the sprite. Below the sprite options in the object interface, we have the collision mask field. This is where we can set the collision mask for this object. It's sometimes necessary to have a collision mask that is separate from the object sprite. All sprites contain their own collision masks, but if for example we have a set of player sprites which consists of different sizes and animations, one for running, one for standing still, or one for jumping, then the collision mask for each one will be different. If we're standing on the ground and then start moving, which changes us to a different sprite with a larger collision box, then the collision box may end up inside the ground and cause us to get stuck. To solve issues like this, we can make a new, separate sprite to use as a collision mask. This might just be a simple black rectangle which represents the player's default size. With the collision mask applied, GameMaker will always use the collision mask defined instead of the normal sprite's collision mask. This means no matter which animation is playing, the collision mask will remain the same. Next up we have some basic toggle options for our objects. The first is the visible option. This is, as you might expect, whether the object is visible or not. This only applies while in-game, meaning the object will still be visible in the room editor. This works by simply not performing the draw event, meaning if you have code there, then it won't run if visible isn't checked. The object will still react to all collision events as normal. Next up is the solid option. This option is fairly basic and has limited use. Essentially, it just tells GameMaker to try and resolve collisions before executing the collision event. This just means moving the object back to the previous X and Y position before the collision occurred. The persistent option makes the object persistent in the game from the point of its creation. This means that as soon as an object with this option selected is created, it will pass over to all subsequent rooms, executing its events as normal up until the point that we actually destroy it. This can be handy for things like controllers, which are objects designed specifically to control aspects of our games. These objects will not execute the create event for each room, as they are only created once and carried over. Restarting the game will clear the object. The last option of this section is Uses Physics. GameMaker Studio 2 uses the Box 2D physics engine to allow for simulated physics within our games. Using physics changes much of the normal flow but can produce some very fun and interesting games. All objects have some physics values set by default, but when the option isn't on, they aren't applied, so turning this option on will apply those settings. In this video, we took a look at the main basic settings for the object interface. In the next video, we'll move on and look at events which provide the main structure of games in GameMaker.